Greetings and salutations. Happy Monday evening. Miss Diana Nicole, I hope everything went well for you today. Glad to see you are here with us, even if only for a little while. Christina, hello. My mom is here. Miss Kathy B. Dari. Claire Bear, I hope you had a good time this weekend where the concert came to Tahoe. Hello, Svetlana. Angelica. Hello, Anna. Hello to all the sexy disciples. Putting it out that way. Oh, I didn't ask if you can hear me this week. Can you hear me? Hello, Miss Emily. Yeah, it's all Wolfgang's fault indeed. Emily, it's good to see you having fun with that ukulele. I hope that's coming along as well as it looks and is as enjoyable as I know it can be and will be. Hello, Miss Terry. Patty Pinkstaff. Roberta Acuna, hello. Melissa Catano is here. Excellent. Oh, hey, Wolfus. Wolfus, Mama loves you. You hear that? Okay. I think that's a message received. Lick, 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 lick. Okay. Well, let us. Hello, Kelsey Blaine Gibson. I can't remember if I said your name yet or not. So, let us do one more button and begin. Ah, good. Working on the chords for Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. Oh, all right. That's wonderful. Okay, I'm going to adjust my microphone for just a moment, so forgive me while it makes all. Okay, I think we're set. Tea, water, whiskey, everything in check all around. Of course, now the microphone is right where every time I sip something, it's going to be booming. All right, I'll call that good. So, thought we would begin this evening's literary sojourn with a spot from Walden. Walden has been quite well received on this show so far. Hello, Scott Gilbert. Scott, you're just in time for the beginning of Walden. This is going to be this particular excerpt from Walden is going to be 3 parts, and tonight's first 10 pages will be volume 1, if you want to call it that. Okay. Making sure the camera doesn't flit about in its focus. Woohoo, what's a Walden? Yeah, if Walden was a sitcom, you'd know what it was. That's one of the greatest literary quotes South Park ever produced. Indeed, what's a Walden? A Walden, in this very specific case, is a pond in Massachusetts around which one of the greatest American transcendentalist writers, Henry David Thoreau, lived for quite a bit of time. Early South Park indeed. God, that might have been like late 90s South Park even. So this first 10-page excerpt is called Where I Lived and What I Lived For, from Walden by Henry David Thoreau. At a certain season of our life, we're accustomed to consider every spot as the possible site of a house. I have thus surveyed the country on every side within a dozen miles of where I live. In imagination, I have bought all the farms in succession, for all were to be bought, and I knew their price. I walked over each farmer's premises, tasted his wild apples, discoursed on husbandry with him, took his farm at his price, at any price, mortgaging it to him just in my mind, even put a higher price on it. Took everything but a deed of it. Took his word for his deed, for I dearly love to talk. Cultivated it, and him too, to some extent, I trust, and withdrew when I had enjoyed it long enough, leaving him to carry it on. This experience entitled me to be regarded as a sort of real estate broker by my friends. Wherever I sat, there I might live, and the landscape radiated from me accordingly. What is a house but a seat? Better, if a country seat. I discovered many a site for a house not likely to be soon improved, which some might have thought too far from the village, but to my eyes, the village was too far from it. Well, there I might live, I said, and there I did live. For an hour, a summer, and a winter. Just a little season of life. Saw how I could let the years run off, buffet the winter through, and see the spring come in. The future inhabitants of this region, wherever they may place their houses, may be sure that they have been anticipated. An afternoon sufficed to lay out the land into orchard, woodlot, and pasture, and to decide what fine oaks or pines should be left to stand before the door, and whence each tree could be seen to the best advantage. And then I let it lie, fallow perchance, for man is rich in proportion to the number of things which he can afford to let alone. My imagination carried me so far that I even had the refusal of several farms. The refusal was all I wanted, but I never got my fingers burned by actual possession. The nearest that I came to actual possession was when I bought the Hollowell place and had begun to sort my seeds and collected materials with which to make a wheelbarrow to carry it off. But before the owner gave me a deed of it, his wife, every man has such a wife, changed her mind and wished to keep it. And he offered me $10 to release him. Now, to speak the truth, I had but 10 cents in the world, and it surpassed my arithmetic to tell if I was that man who had 10 cents, or who had a farm, or $10, or all together. However, I let him keep the $10 and the farm too, for I had carried it far enough. Or rather, to be generous, I sold him the farm for just what I gave for it, and as he was not a rich man, made him a present of $10, and still had my 10 cents and seeds and materials for a wheelbarrow left. I found thus that I had been a rich man without any damage to my poverty. But I retained the landscape, and I have since annually carried off what it yielded without a wheelbarrow. With respect to landscapes, I am monarch of all I survey. My right there is none to dispute. Now, of course, we associate that with The Lion King, 1994, but Thoreau was actually quoting William Cowper, who was a poet. I have frequently seen a poet withdraw, having enjoyed the most valuable part of a farm, while the crusty farmer supposed that he had got a few wild apples only. Why, the owner does not know it for many years when a poet has put his farm in rhyme. The most admirable kind of invisible fence has fairly impounded it, milked it, skimmed it, got all the cream, and left the farmer only the skimmed milk. The real attractions of the Hollowell farm, to me, were its complete retirement, being about 2 miles from the village, half a mile from the nearest neighbor, and separated from the highway by a broad field. It's bounding on the river, which the owner said protected it by its fogs from frost in the spring, though that was nothing to me. The gray color and ruinous state of the house and barn, and the dilapidated fences, which put such an interval between me and the last occupant, the hollow and lichen-covered apple trees gnawed by rabbits, showing what kind of neighbors I should have, but, above all, the recollection I had of it from my earliest voyages up the river, when the house was concealed behind a dense grove of red maples. I was in haste to buy it before the proprietor finished getting out some rocks, cutting down the hollow apple trees, and grubbing up some young birches which had sprung up in the pasture, or, in short, had made any more of his improvements. To enjoy these advantages, I was ready to carry it on, like Atlas, to take the world on my shoulders. I never heard what compensation he received for that. And do all those things which had no other motive or excuse, but that I might pay for it and be unmolested in my possession of it, for I knew all the while that it would yield the most abundant crop of the kind I wanted, if only I could afford to let it alone. But it turned out as I have said. All that I could say then, with respect to farming on a large scale, I've always cultivated a garden, was that I had had my seeds ready. Many think that seeds improve with age. I have no doubt that time discriminates between the good and the bad, and when at last I shall plant, I shall be less likely to be disappointed. But I would say to my fellows, once for all, as long as possible, live free and uncommitted. It makes but little difference whether you are committed to a farm or the county jail. Old Cato, whose De Re Rustica is my cultivator, says, and the only translation I have seen makes sheer nonsense of the passage, when you think of getting a farm, turn it thus in your mind, not to buy greedily, nor spare your pains to look at it, and do not think it enough to go round it once. The more often you go there, the more it will please you if it is good. I think I shall not buy greedily, but go round and round it as long as I live, and be buried in it first, that it may please me the more at last. The present was my next experiment of this kind, which I propose to describe more at length, for convenience, putting the experience of 2 years into one. As I have said, I do not propose to write an ode to dejection, but to brag as lustily as a chanticleer in the morning, standing on his roost, if only to wake my neighbors up. I remember earlier in life I actually had that printed on a t-shirt. Where that t-shirt went, I have no idea. When first I took up my abode in the woods, that is, began to spend my nights as well as days there, which by accident was on Independence Day, or the 4th of July, 1845. My house was not finished for winter, but was merely a defense against the rain, without plastering or chimney, the walls being of rough, weather-stained boards with wide chinks which made it cool at night. The upright, white-hewn studs and freshly planed door and window casings gave it a clean and airy look, especially in the morning when its timbers were saturated with dew, so that I fancied that by noon some sweet gum would exude from them. To my imagination, it retained throughout the day more or less of this auroral character, reminding me of a certain house on a mountain which I had visited the year before. This was an airy and unplastered cabin, fit to entertain a traveling god, and where a goddess might trail her garments. The winds, which had passed over my dwelling, were such as sweep over the ridges of the mountains, bearing the broken strains, or the celestial parts only of terrestrial music. The morning wind forever blows, the poem of creation is uninterrupted, but few are the ears that hear it. Olympus is but the outside of the earth, everywhere. The only house I had been the owner of before, if I except one boat, was a tent, which I used occasionally when making excursions in the summer, and this is still rolled up in my garret. But the boat, after passing from hand to hand, has gone down the stream of time. With this more substantial shelter about me, I had made some progress toward settling in the world. This frame, so slightly clad, was a sort of crystallization around me and reacted on the builder. It was suggestive, somewhat, as a picture in outlines. I did not need to go outdoors to take the air, for the atmosphere within had lost none of its freshness. It was not so much within doors as behind a door where I sat, even in the rainiest weather. The Harivasana says, "An abode without birds is like a meat without seasoning." Such was not my abode, for I found myself suddenly neighbor to the birds, not by having imprisoned one, but having caged myself near them. I was not only nearer to some of those which commonly frequent the garden and the orchard, but to those wilder and more thrilling songsters of the forest which never or rarely serenade a villager. The wood thrush, the veery, the scarlet tanager, the field sparrow, the whippoorwill, and many others. Yeah, so I can certainly relate to that last bit about neighboring the birds, as I'm sure most of you have heard me discuss probably at great length. It's funny, he calls it a scarlet tanager, but we have a red tanager that comes to Big Bear. I've not seen one in person yet. I've only read about them in bird books that they come here, but they are a vivid red, and not to be confused with the western tanager, which is vivid yellow and red. Funny what he was saying about the birds, the songs, the neighbors that they make. I've been paying really close attention lately, especially to see chickadees are really cute. Let me just say that right off. Mountain chickadees are no exception. Chickadees are very intelligent as a group. I don't know individually that they're all that bright. You're not gonna see them competing against ravens in tool making competitions or anything, but as groups. Yeah, Patty, my feeders are back up. I've got all the feeders back up. And so this is one of the reasons that I'm able to pay such close attention to the chickadees in particular. The chickadees go around in specific little groups, like tiny mini flocks. And each mini flock has its own signature song. And the difference between one flock's song and another flock's song is typically the same three notes and in exactly the same order. Around my cabin here, it's A, G, F sharp. But the difference from flock to flock is which notes are emphasized and which notes are doubled or even tripled, quadrupled. And so the ones that have declared the front yard of the cabin to be their flock territory have a song of A, A, G, F sharp. And they have competition, because when I had to take the feeders in, the edges of the chickadees' territories started moving around, because this no longer being a place of food abundance, a veritable bird buffet, suddenly became like a lot less valuable. And I can't tell the individual chickadees apart from each other, but I can now hear the differences in their various flock song. And so the AAGF sharp group started getting impinged upon by an A, G, F sharp group that was kind of coming in on the borders. It was it was. Once you know what to listen to, it's kind of this amazing soap opera drama of little cute birds, and they are. Yeah, they're adorable though, and they have warnings, like a very particular call that. Thank you, Miss Mary. Hi, thank you for joining us. The the chickadees have a particular call that is, for example, a danger warning, and there's a different set of repeating sounds that only two of these particular sounds means there's just a little bit of danger, nothing that's like hunting you actively, but just everybody keep your heads up. Don't do anything stupid. Don't go anywhere without looking first. And Wolfgang gets all 5 iterations of that warning call when they're as well as do the occasional red-tailed hawk that comes through, and maybe the sharp-shinned hawk that was traveling through. So, hi, buddy, you're reaching for my hand. Okay, enough about birds. Let's move from birds to dogs. There are 2 authors that most specifically notably come to mind when discussing stories of dogs, or canids, I should more generalize. One, of course, is the great, immortal Jack London. The other one is this guy, Walter Dyer. Dyer lived from 1878 to 1943. And so he died during World War II. He was an American author, and you'll notice, just like with Jack London, there's a dog character in this that isn't just set dressing, that isn't just a monster or a creature who moves without motivation. There's a dog in this who is very much a character with its own inner life. And the dog's inner life, you will see, moves the plot forward in a meaningful way. So, this story is called Gulliver the Great by Walter A. Dyer. It takes place somewhere in the early 1900s. It was a mild evening in early spring, and the magnolias were in bloom. We motored around the park, turned up a side street, and finally came to a throbbing standstill before the Churchwarden Club. There was nothing about its exterior to indicate that it was a clubhouse at all, but within, there was an indefinable atmosphere of early Victorian comfort. There was something about it that suggested Mr. Pickwick. Mr. Pickwick was an old serial, so there was a series of publications. It was also Charles Dickens' I think, first novel. So it was Kind of like a sitcom of the time, but in print. Old prints of horses and ships and battles hung upon the walls, and the oak was dark and old. There seemed to be no decorative scheme or keynote, and yet the atmosphere was utterly distinctive. It was my first visit to the Churchwarden Club, of which my quaint, old-fashioned Uncle Ford had long been a member, and I was charmed. We dined in the Rathskeller. Now, the Rathskeller would be like a cellar that is converted to be, say, a restaurant or a beer hall in the basement of a building. We dined in the Rathskeller, the walls of which were completely covered with long churchwarden pipes arranged in the most intricate and marvelous patterns. And after our mutton chop and ale and plum pudding, we filled with the choicest of tobaccos the pipes which the old major domo brought us. Then came Jacob R. Enderby to smoke with us. Tall and spare he was, with long, straight black hair, large aquiline nose, and piercing eyes. I disgraced myself by staring at him. I didn't know that such a man existed in New York, and yet I couldn't decide whether his habitat should be Arizona or Cape Cod. Enderby and Uncle Ford were deep in a discussion of the statesmanship of James G. Blaine when a waiter summoned my uncle to the telephone. Now, I neglected to state that my uncle, in his prosaic hours, is a physician, and this was a call. I knew it the moment I saw the waiter approaching. I was disappointed and disgusted. Uncle Ford saw this, and he just laughed. "Ah, cheer up," said he. "You needn't come with me to visit the sick. I'll be back in an hour, and meanwhile, Mr. Enderby will take care of you. Won't you, Jake?" For an answer, Enderby arose and, refilling his pipe, took me by the arm while my uncle got into his overcoat. As he passed us on the way out, he whispered into my ear, "Psst. Talk about dogs." I heard, and I nodded. Enderby led me to the lounge, or loafing room, an oak-paneled apartment in the rear of the floor above, with huge leather chairs and a seat in the bay window. Save for a gray-haired old chap dozing over a copy of Simplicicus, the room was deserted. But no sooner had Enderby seated himself on the window seat than there was a rush and a commotion and a short, glad bark, and Nubbins, the steward's bull terrier, bounded in and landed at Enderby's side with canine expressions of great joy. I reached forward to pat him, but he paid absolutely no attention to me. At last his wriggling subsided, and he settled down with his head on Enderby's knee, the picture of content. Then I recalled my uncle's parting injunction. "Friend of yours?" I suggested. Enderby smiled. "Yes," he said. "We're friends, I guess." And the funny part of it is that he doesn't pay attention to anyone else except his master. They all act with me that way. Dogs do. And he pulled Nubbin's stubby ears. "Natural attraction, I suppose?" said I. "Yes, it is," he answered with the modest frankness of a big man. "It's a thing hard to explain, though there's a sort of reason for it in my case." I hopefully pushed toward him a little tobacco-laden teakwood stand. He refilled it and lighted it. "It's an extraordinary thing, even so," he said, puffing. "Every dog, nowadays, seems to look upon me as his long-lost master, but it wasn't always so. I hated dogs, and they hated me. Not wishing to say really or indeed to this big outdoorsman, I simply grunted my surprise. Yes, we were born enemies. More than that, I was afraid of dogs. A little fuzzy toy dog ambling up to me in a room full of company with his tail wagging gave me the shudders. I couldn't touch the beast. And as for big dogs outdoors, I feared them like the plague. I would go blocks out of my way to avoid one. I don't remember being particularly cowardly about other things, but I just couldn't help this. It was in my blood for some reason or another. It was the bane of my existence. I couldn't see what the brutes were put into the world for, or how anyone could have anything to do with them. And the dogs reciprocated. They disliked and distrusted me. The most docile old Brunos would growl and show their teeth when I came near. Did the change come suddenly? I asked. Quite. It was in 1901. I accepted a commission from an importing and trading company to go to the Philippines to do a little quiet exploring and spent 4 months in the sickly place. Then I got the fever. And when I recovered, I couldn't get out of there too soon. I reached Manila just in time to see the mail steamer disappearing around the point, and I was mad. There would be another in 6 days, but I couldn't wait. I was just crazy to get back home. I made inquiries, and learning of an old tramp of a steamer named the Old Squaw, it was getting ready to make its leave for Honolulu on the following day with a cargo of hemp and various stuff. Hemp, by the way, is just rope. Let's be clear. It had a lot of things in the cargo and a bunch of moros for some show in the States, and I booked passage on that. Now, Moros, it should be noted, Moros are the Muslims that live in the Philippines at this time. And I don't know personally what the history of places like Morro Bay in California or Morro Rock in Giant Sequoia State Park, if that is a related Moro, but it's all spelled the same. So yeah, Moros, Muslims living in the Philippines. The boat. She was the worst old tub you ever saw. I didn't learn much about her, but I verily believe her to have been condemned. Some former excursion boat. She would not have been allowed to run to Coney Island. She was battered and unpainted, and she wallowed horribly. I don't believe she could have reached Honolulu much before the next regular boat, but I couldn't wait. So I took her. I made myself as comfortable as possible, bribed the cook to ensure myself against starvation, and swung a hammock on the forward deck as far as possible from the worst of the vile smells. But we hadn't lost sight of Manila Bay when I discovered that there was a dog aboard. And such a dog. I'd never seen one like this that sent me into such a panic as this one could, and he had free range of the entire ship. A Great Dane he was, named Gulliver, and he was the pride of the captain's rum-soaked heart. With all my fear, I realized he was a magnificent animal, but I looked on him as a gigantic devil. Without exception, he was the biggest dog I ever saw, and as muscular as a lion. He lacked some points that show judges set score by, but he had the size, and he had the build. He was a monster. I've seen the Volkswulkan and the Württemberg breed, but they were fox terriers compared to this guy Gulliver. His tail was as big around as my arm, and the cook lived in terror of his getting into the galley and wagging it. And he had a mouth that looked like the crater of Mauna Loa, and a voice that shook the planking when he spoke. This is one of those details I love about this story. It's this dog never barks. This dog only speaks. I first caught sight of him appearing from behind a huge coil of cordage in the stern. He stretched and yawned, and I nearly died of fright. I caught up a belaying pin, though little good that would have done me. I think he saw me do it, too, and doubtless he set me down for an enemy then and there. We were well out of the harbor, and there was no turning back. But I would have given my right hand to be off that boat. I fully expected him to eat me up, and I slept with that belaying pin sticking into my ribs in the hammock and with my revolver loaded and handy. Fortunately, Gulliver's dislike for me took the form of sublime contempt. He knew I was afraid of him, and he despised me for it. He was a great pet with the captain and with the crew, and even the Moros treated him with admiring respect when they were allowed on deck. I couldn't understand it. I would have as soon made a pet of a hungry boa constrictor. On the third day out, the poor old boiler burst and the old squaw caught fire. She was dry and rotten inside, and she burned like tinder. No attempt was made to extinguish the flames which got into the hemp in the hold in short order. The smoke was damp and stifling, and in a jiffy all hands were struggling with the boats. The Moros came tumbling up from below and added to the confusion with their terrified yells. The davits were old and rusty, and the men were soon fighting among themselves. Davits are like winches and sort of like lowering apparatuses that you put life rafts and boats into the water from a tall ship. One boat dropped stern foremost, filled and sank immediately, and the old squaw herself was visibly settling. I saw there was no chance of getting away in the boats, and I recalled a life raft on the deck forward near my hammock. It was a sort of catamaran, a double platform on a pair of hollow, watertight, cylindrical buoys. It wasn't 20 feet long and about half as broad, but it would have to do. I fancy it was a forgotten relic of the old excursion boat days. There was no time to lose, for the old squaw was bound to sink presently. Besides, I was aft with the rest, and the flames were licking up the deck and running gear in the waist of the boat. The galley, which was amidships near the engine room, had received the full force of the explosion, and the cook lay moaning in the lee scuppers with a small water cask thumping against his chest. I couldn't stop to help the man, but I did kick the cask away. It seemed to be nearly full, and it occurred to me that I should need it. I glanced quickly around and luckily found a tin of biscuits that had also been blown out of the galley. I picked this up, and rolling the cask of water ahead of me as rapidly as I could, I made my way through the hot, stifling smoke to the bow of the boat. I kicked at the life raft. It seemed to be sound, and I lashed the biscuits and water to it. I also threw on a coil of rope and a piece of sailcloth. I saw nothing else about that could possibly be of any value to me. I abandoned my trunk for fear it would only prove troublesome. Then I hacked the raft loose with my knife and shoved it over to the bulwark. Apparently, no one had seen me, for there was no one else forward of the sheet of flame that now cut the boat in two. The raft was a mighty heavy affair, but I managed to rise one end to the rail. I don't believe I would have ever been able to heave it over under any circumstances, but I didn't have to. I felt a great upheaval, and the prow of the old squaw went up into the air. I grabbed the ropes that I had lashed the food on with and clung to the raft. The deck, the boat itself, the ship became almost perpendicular, and it was a miracle that the raft didn't slide down with me into the flames. Somehow it stuck where it was. Then the boat sank with a great roar, and for about 1,000 years, it seemed to me, I was underwater. I didn't do anything. I couldn't think. I was only conscious of a tremendous weight of water and a feeling that I would burst open. Instinct alone made me cling to the raft. When it finally brought me to the surface, I was as nearly dead as I care to be. I lay there on the thing in a half-conscious condition for an endless time. If my life had depended on my doing something, I would have been lost. Then gradually I came to and began to spit out salt water and gasp for breath. I gathered my wits together and sat up. My hands were absolutely numb, and I had to loosen the grip of my fingers with the help of my toes. Odd sensation, that. Then I looked about me. My biscuits and water and rope were safe, but the sailcloth had vanished. I remember that this annoyed me hugely at the time, though I don't know what earthly good it would have been. The sea was fairly calm, and I could see all about. Not a human being was visible, and only a few floating bits of wreckage. Every man on board must have gone down with the ship and drowned, except myself. Then I caught sight of something that made my heart stand still. The huge head of Gulliver was coming rapidly toward me through the water. The dog was swimming strongly, and it must have leapt from the old squaw before she sank. My raft was the only thing afloat large enough to hold him, and he knew it. I drew my revolver, but it was soaking wet and useless. Then I sat down on the cracker tin and gritted my teeth and waited. I had been alarmed, I must admit, when the boiler blew up and the panic began, but that was nothing to the terror that seized me now, seeing that beast swim toward my raft. Here I was, all alone on top of the Pacific Ocean with this horrible demon making for me as fast as he could swim. My mind was benumbed, and I could think of nothing to do. I trembled, and my teeth rattled. I prayed for a shark. I prayed for an actual shark, but no shark came. Soon, Gulliver reached the raft and placed one of his forepaws on it, and then the other. The top of it stood 6 or 8 inches above the water, and it took great effort for the dog to raise himself. I wanted to kick him back, but I didn't dare to move. Gulliver struggled mightily. Again and again he reared his great shoulders above the sea, only to be cast back, scratching and kicking at a lurch of the raft. Finally, a wave favored him, and he caught the edge of the under platform with one of his hind feet. With a stupendous effort, he heaved his huge bulk over the edge and lay sprawling at my feet, panting and trembling. Enderby paused and gazed out of the window with a big sigh, as though the recital of his story had brought back some of the horror of his remarkable experience. Nubbins, Nubbins, the present tense terrier, looked up inquiringly, then snuggled closer to his friend while Enderby smoothed the white head. Well, he continued, there we were. You can't possibly imagine how I felt unless you too have been afflicted with dog fear. God, it was awful. And I hated the brute so. I could have torn him limb from limb if I had the strength, but he was vastly more powerful than I. I could only fear him. By and by, he got up and shook himself. I cowered on my cracker tin, but he only looked at me contemptuously, went to the other end of the raft, and lay down to wait patiently for deliverance. We remained this way until nightfall. The sea was comparatively calm, and we seemed to be drifting, but slowly. We were in the path of ships likely to be passing one way or the other, and I would have been hopeful of the outcome if it had not been for my feared and hated companion. I began to feel faint and opened the cracker tin. The biscuits were wet with salt water, but I ate a couple and left the cover of the tin open to dry them. Gulliver looked around, and I shut the tin hastily, but the dog never moved. He was not disposed to ask any favors. By kicking the sides of the cask and prying with my knife, I managed to get the bung out, which is like a huge cork that you stuff in the end of a barrel. I managed to get the bung out and took a drink. Then I settled myself on the raft with my back against the cask and longed for a smoke. The gentle motion of the raft produced a lulling effect on my exhausted nerves, and I began to nod, only to awake with a start, with fear gripping at my heart. I dared not sleep. I don't know what I thought Gulliver would do to me, for I just did not understand dogs, but I felt that I must watch him. I must watch him constantly. In the starlight, I could see that his eyes were open. Gulliver was watchful, too. All night long, I kept up a running fight with drowsiness. I dozed at intervals, but never for long at a time. It was a horrible night, and I cannot tell you how I longed for day and welcomed it when it came. I must have slept toward dawn, for I suddenly became conscious of a broad daylight. I roused myself, stood up, and swung my arms and legs to stir up circulation, for the night had been chilly. Gulliver arose, too, and stood silently watching me until I ceased for fear. When he had settled down again, I got my breakfast out of the cracker tin. Gulliver was restless, and was evidently interested. He must be hungry, I thought, and then a new fear caught me. I had only to wait until he became very hungry, and then he would surely attack me. I concluded that it would be wiser to feed him, and I tossed him a biscuit. I expected to see him grab it ravenously and wondered as soon as I had thrown it if the taste of food would only serve to make him more ferocious. But at first, he would not touch it. He only lay there with his great head on his paws and glowered at me. Distrust was plainly visible in his face. I had never realized before that a dog's face could express the subtler emotions. His gaze fascinated me, and I could not take my eyes from his. The bulk of him was tremendous as he lay there, and I noticed the big swelling muscles of his jaw. At last he arose, sniffed suspiciously at the biscuit, and looked up at me again. "It's all right. Eat it," I cried. The sound of my own voice frightened me. I had not intended to speak to him, but in spite of my strained tone, he seemed somewhat reassured. He took a little nibble, then swallowed the biscuit after one or two crunches and looked up expectantly. I threw him another, and he ate that. That's all, said I. We must be sparing of them. I was amazed to discover how perfectly he understood. He lay down, and he licked his chops. Late in the forenoon, I saw a line of smoke on the horizon, and soon a steamer came into view. I stood up and waved my coat frantically, but to no purpose. Gulliver stood up and looked from me to the steamer, apparently much interested. "Too far off," I said to Gulliver. "I hope the next one will come nearer." At midday, I dined and fed Gulliver. This time, he took the 2 biscuits, quite without reserve, and whacked his great tail against the raft. It seemed to me that his attitude was less hostile, and I wondered at it. When I took my drink from the cask, Gulliver showed signs of interest. "I suppose dogs get thirsty too," I said aloud. Gulliver rapped with his tail. I looked about for some sort of receptacle and finally just pulled off my shoe, filled it with water, and shoved it toward him carefully with my foot. He drank gratefully. During the afternoon, I sighted another ship, but it was too distant to notice me. However, the sea remained calm, and I did not despair. After we had had supper, I settled back against my cask, resolved to keep awake, for still I did not trust Gulliver. The sun set suddenly and the stars came out, and I found myself strangely lonesome. It seemed as though I had been alone out there in the Pacific for weeks. The miles and miles of heaving water, almost on a level with my eye, were beginning to get on my nerves. I longed for someone to talk to, and I wished I had dragged the half-breed cook along with me for company. I sighed loudly, and Gulliver raised his head. "Lonesome out here, isn't it?" I said, simply to hear the sound of my own voice. Then, for the first time, Gulliver spoke. He made a deep sound in his throat, and with all my ignorance of dog language, somehow I knew it wasn't a growl. Then I began to talk. I talked about everything. The people back home and all that, and Gulliver listened. I know more about dogs now, and I know that the best way to make friends with a dog is to talk to him. He can't talk back, but he can understand a heap more than you think he can. Finally, Gulliver, who had kept his distance all this time, arose and came toward me. My words died in my throat. What was he going to do? To my immense relief, he did nothing but sink down at my feet with a grunt and curl his huge body into a semicircle. He had dignity, Gulliver had. He wanted to be friendly, but he would not presume. However, I had lost interest in conversation and sat just watching him, just wondering. In spite of my firm resolution, I fell asleep at length from sheer exhaustion and never woke again until daybreak. The sky was clouded over and our craft was pitching. Gulliver was standing in the middle of the raft, looking at me in evident alarm. I glanced over my shoulder, and the blackness of the horizon told me the storm was coming, and coming soon. I made fast our slender provender, tied the end of a line about my own waist for safety, and waited. In a short time, the storm struck us in all its tropical fury. The raft pitched and tossed, now high up at one end and now at the other, and sometimes almost engulfed in the waves. Gulliver was having a desperate time to keep aboard. His blunt claws slipped on the wet deck of the raft, and he fell and slid about dangerously. The thought flashed across my mind that the storm might prove to be a blessing in disguise, and that I might soon be rid of the brute. As I clung there to the lashings, I saw him slip down to the further end of the raft, his hindquarters actually over the edge. A wave swept over him, but still he clung, panting madly, and the raft righted itself for a moment, and as he hung there, he gave me a look I shall never forget. A look of fear, of pleading, of reproach, and yet of silent courage. And with all my stupidity, I read that look. Somehow, it told me that I was the master, after all, and he the dog. I could not resist it. Cautiously, I raised myself and loosened the spare rope I had saved. As the raft tipped the other way, Gulliver regained his footing and came sliding toward me. Quickly, I passed the rope around his body, and as the raft dived again, I hung onto the rope with one hand, retaining my own hold with the other. Gulliver's weight nearly pulled my arm from its socket, but he helped mightily, and during the next moment of equilibrium, I took another turn about his body and made the end of the rope fast. The storm passed as swiftly as it had come, and though it left us drenched and exhausted, we were both safe. That evening, Gulliver crept close to me as I talked, and I let him. Loneliness will make a man do strange things. On the 5th day, when our provisions were nearly gone, and I had begun to feel the sinking dullness of despair, I sighted a steamer, apparently coming directly toward us. Instantly, I felt new life in my limbs and around my heart, and while the boat was yet miles away, I began to shout and wave my coat. "I believe she's coming, old man!" I cried to Gulliver. "I believe she's coming!" I soon wearied of this foolishness and sat down to wait. Gulliver came close and sat beside me, and for the first time, I put my hand on him. He looked up at me and rapped furiously with his tail. I patted his head, a little gingerly, I must confess. It was a big, smooth head, and it felt solid and strong. I passed my hand down his neck, his back, his flanks. He seemed to quiver with joy. He leaned his huge body against me. Then he bowed his head and licked my shoe. A feeling of intense shame and unworthiness came over me with the realization of how completely I had misunderstood him. Why should this great, powerful creature lick my shoe? It was incredible. Then, somehow, everything changed. Fear and distrust left me, and a feeling of comradeship and understanding took their place. We two had been through so much together. A dog was no longer a frightful beast to me. He was a dog. I cannot think of a nobler word. And Gulliver had licked my shoe. I mean, doubtless it was only the fineness of his perception that had prevented him from licking my hand. I might have resented that. I put my arms suddenly around Gulliver's neck and I hugged him. I loved that dog. Slowly, the steamer crawled along, but still she kept to her course. When she was about a mile away, however, I saw that she would not pass as near to us as I had hoped, so I began once more my waving and yelling. She came nearer and nearer, but still showed no sign of observing us. She was abreast of us and passing. I was in a frenzy. She was so near that I could make out the figure of the captain on the bridge and other figures on the deck below. It seemed as though they must see us, though I realized how low in the water we stood and how pitifully weak and hoarse my voice was. I had been a fool to waste it. Then an idea struck me. "Speak!" I cried to Gulliver, who stood watching beside me. "Speak, old man!" Gulliver needed no second bidding. A roar like that of all the bulls of Bashan rolled out over the Pacific. Again and again, Gulliver gave voice, deep, full, and powerful. His great sides heaved with the mighty effort, his red, cavernous mouth open, and his head raised high. "Good! Good old man!" I cried. "Good!" And again, that magnificent voice boomed forth. Then, something happened on board the steamer. The figures came to the side. I waved my coat and danced. Then, they saw us. I was pretty well done when they took us aboard, and I slept for 24 hours straight. When at last I woke, there sat Gulliver by my bunk. And when I turned to look at him, he lifted a great paw and he put it on my arm. Enderby ceased the story, and there was silence in the room, save for the light snoring of Nubbins. "You took him home with you, I suppose?" I asked. Enderby nodded. "And you have him still? I certainly wanted to have a look at that dog." But he did not answer. I saw an expression of great sadness come into his eyes as he gazed out of the window, and I knew that Jacob Enderby had finished his story. Well, ladies and gentlemen, this concludes Fireside Tales with Wolfgang, episode 31. If you have the means and are so inclined, please drop something in the virtual tip jar here. And this Thursday is going to be a special and unique Lovecast. I'm going to have our first live in-person guest. I will be fully vaccinated, and so will my guest, Ned Clark, who wrote the song Fall Canyon Trail, and a lot of others, is going to come and join me. We'll get Ned to play a song or two himself, maybe accompany me and sing some harmonies as well. So I am looking forward to this Thursday. Have not decided if we're going to try to squeeze myself and Ned here in front of the fireplace or if we'll do it out on the balcony and do it outside. But yeah, yay, Ned is coming. So I will bid you all adieu for now. Give you just a minute or two to say goodbye to each other in the chat. Thank you all for joining us. And we will see you Thursday at 6 o'clock.